The Ancient Kingdoms of Peru by Nigel Davies. Chapter 2. Mochi. Basic to the study of the Mochi culture is some definition of the different phases of its development. A beginning in this respect was made as early as 1899 by Max Yule, who excavated 31 grave lots from the pyramids in the real Mochi Valley, the site that had given its name to the whole culture, whose remains have since been found over a more extensive area. Mochi was then divided into 5 phases, covering the first 6 centuries of the Christian era, proposed by Raphael d'Arcohoyle in 1948. His definition of their chronology was based on burials in various sites that embraced all these 5 phases, each of which displayed certain characteristics of its own. A most unusual feature of Mochi's studies is the fact that the most spectacular vestiges, far from emerging at an early stage, were only discovered quite recently. Not until 1987, some 80 years after the first investigations of Max Yule in the real Mochi Valley, were the most dazzling remains of the Mochi culture revealed to the world, not initially by archaeologists but by robbers. As described by Sidney Kirkpatrick, the location of certain Mochi tombs in the heart of Waka, a pyramid complex near the village of Sipan, situated on the remote sun-baked plains of Lambayeque, some 170 kilometers north of the Rio Moche, remained a lost secret until a team of impoverished thieves penetrated one of these tombs on a cool, moonlit night in February 1987. The most vivid account of how this tomb came to be opened was that of Ernil Bernal, an unemployed truck driver and the self-appointed spokesman for the looters. Ernil and his friends had carved a tunnel into the smallest of the 3 pyramids of Waka. Their first find was a clutch of gold beads of a quality never unearthed in any other Moche site. In addition, construction techniques were visible in a roof above their heads of a kind that had never been found by professional investigators in sites looted long ago. At each level of penetration, the architecture of the pyramid changed. In seeking an exit from the structure, Ernil's rod penetrated the floor of a room suspended above his tunnel, and he unexpectedly found himself in an intact royal burial chamber that poured out its contents until he was buried up to his shoulders in a trove of priceless gold and silver ornaments, together with ancient carvings studded with precious stones. But before presenting in more detail the story of what has emerged from Waka, it may be more congruent, first, to record the results of the earlier Moche research, which, among other notable finds, yielded so many painted ceramic vases, which illustrated precisely the type of treasures finally uncovered in Waka. The better-known Moche sites had been looted so long ago. Hence, no unviolated tomb of a Moche lord, containing the very kind of objects shown on these ceramics, had ever been excavated by archaeologists. Moche research. Records of anything resembling the culture of the Moche period were lacking in folk tradition of late pre-Conquest times. However, nebulous accounts apparently survived of coastal kingdoms that preceded the Chimu period, which began in about 780 and for which certain lists, including names of specific rulers, did survive, as we shall see in Chapter 5. Among reports of such pre-Chimu coastal kingdoms, the clearest is that of Bishop Bartolom de las Casas, writing around 1550. He refers to an early period that lasted about 500 or 600 years, during which many separate principalities thrived, some larger than others, but none of great size. The people of the coast, during this early period, reportedly used javelins in their wars, whereas the contemporary Highlanders employed slings as their chief weapon of offense. The early rulers would build their palaces on hills or, if none were available, would cause their people to pile up vast mounds of earth in order to make an artificial eminence, a practice which, as we shall see, indeed prevailed during the period of which the mud brick pyramids of the Rio Moche Valley are among the most visible surviving evidence. As related by the earliest investigators, at about the beginning of the Christian era, a culture began to develop which gradually became predominant in all the river valleys from the Rio Piura southwards to the Rio Huarni, a distance of over 500 kilometers, and which lasted until the 8th century AD. It was named Moche because the most conspicuous remains were found on that river, and the division into 5 phases, Moche 1 to 5, is in effect based on these remains. But while the Moche culture occupied a long coastline, its east-west extension was limited, and Moche settlements are found only between the sea and the canyons that lead up to the high Andes, a distance of between 60 and 80 kilometers. The vestiges of the first of the 5 phases, Moche I, correspond approximately to the beginning of the Christian era. The Great Pyramids of Cerro Blanco and the Rio Moche Valley, representing the period Moche I to Moche IV, survived until shortly before AD 600, when they appeared to have been struck by catastrophic floods, and the site was abandoned after everything was buried by sand dunes, except for the 2 Great Pyramids still visible today. It is, however, important to stress that whereas research of Moche I to Moche IV was until quite recently concentrated on Cerro Blanco and nearby sites, it is now believed that even in these earlier phases the Moche civilization extended further north, up to the Rio Lambayeque Valley, and even beyond. Moreover, the final phase, Moche V, is to be found more in places further to the north, centered upon the important site of Pampa Grande, at the neck of the Rio Lambayeque Valley, which survived until about AD 700. The ceramics of Moche V already exhibit some traits of the Huari culture that followed the demise of Moche. In other respects, also the Moche V's style differs markedly from that of the earlier phases. Antecedents. The Moche culture of the northern coast of Peru had certain antecedents in the last 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, following the termination of the Copisnique period. Of the first of these Moche predecessors, known as Salinar, a series of burials derived from a beach site located 11 kilometers northwest of the city of Trujillo. The site extends about 4 kilometers along the beach and up to 1 kilometer inland. New forms and features appear in Salinar pottery, whose decoration consisted mainly of white painted beads or dots on a red paste. Use of copper was added to the earlier gold working tradition. During the Salinar phase of the area, cultivation in the Rio Moche Valley was greatly enlarged. Another Salinar site, Cerro Arena, is also situated in the Rio Moche Valley about 10 kilometers inland. This ridgetop settlement has well-preserved domestic architecture and a few small temple mounds. In the 1st century BC, Salinar was followed by another pre-Moche culture known as Gallinazo, which in effect overmaps with Moche I. Gallinazo architects already undertook impressive projects, including terrace platforms built at a fairly high level. A major Gallinazo site was situated on the west side of Cerro Blanco, where the Great Moche Pyramids were later to be built. The nature of this settlement is difficult to assess because of the subsequent Moche occupation. It is possible that the Moche Pyramid of the Moon may owe its origins to this period. An important Gallinazo site was Cerro Orejas, also situated along the Rio Moche Valley, somewhat further inland than Cerro Arena. The site is more than 3 kilometers in length, and 2 large platforms of mud bricks survive, together with many rooms that served as domestic quarters. Irrigation, which may have begun even earlier, certainly existed in Gallinazo times, when large canals were constructed. Gallinazo produced impressive effigy pots of a type that became so typical of Moche, while its architectural concepts were also, in effect, the predecessors those of Moche. The Mochi Mountains. The beginning of the 1st century AD marked the outset of the Moche era, with its grandiose buildings of mud brick. At the site of Cerro Blanco, situated to the south of the Rio Moche, somewhat nearer to the sea than Cerro Orejas, was erected the Pyramid of the Sun, the largest of the Moche pyramids, and one of the biggest monuments ever constructed in pre-Hispanic America. It covers more than 5 hectares at its base and rises to a height of 41 meters. During the 17th century, looters diverted waters from the Rio Moche in an attempt to undercut the Pyramid of the Sun, and thus facilitate the removal of its contents at every level. As a result, about 2/3 of the platform was destroyed and the western side was washed away. Written evidence survives of the impressive loot extracted at that time. From the great gap in the structure created by this flooding, it can be seen that construction properly began in Phase 1 of the Moche style and continued until the end of Phase 4. At a distance of about 500 meters to the south of the Pyramid of the Sun is a monument known as the Pyramid of the Moon. It differs from the Pyramid of the Sun since it is really a complex of 3 platforms formerly enclosed by high adobe walls. The smallest of these platforms was built at the outset of the Moche era, whereas the largest was not erected until the Moche III stage. Unlike the Pyramid of the Sun, the walls of the Pyramid of the Moon were adorned with impressive murals. These two great monuments form part of a large urban complex filled with fine adobe residences for the ruling class, together with grand courts with niched walls and many workshops for skilled artisans. Little of this complex survived after much of the city was stricken by great floods in about AD 600. The destruction was so devastating that the exact nature of such buildings is not easy to determine, though houses depicted on moche pots provide clues. Two types of construction are illustrated on this moche pottery. The more imposing adobe structures are shown as being built on a platform or pyramid. These appear to be either the houses of important people or possibly religious buildings. In some cases, what appear to be groups of mourners or worshippers are shown in front of them. Other painted pots depict a more modest type of dwelling of a kind that may commonly be seen today in the nearby countryside. Such houses are illustrated as open-walled, possibly an artistic convention to enable the viewer to see the person or scene depicted inside the house. Previous to the much more recent discovery of the Saipan tombs, yielding dramatic evidence of moche burial practices, excavations of moche sites have produced massive quantities of fine painted pots, but no burials remotely comparable to those of Saipan. Only one grave of the first moche phase was found at the base of the Pyramid of the Sun. A few burials of Moche II were excavated at the foot of the western side of the Pyramid of the Moon. The typical stirrup spout bottles of this phase differed only in detail from those of Phase 1. Further variations occur in Phase 3, when the spout is wide and short, as in the two previous phases, but the upper part has a pronounced flare. In Phase 4, whose stirrup spout samples are by far the most numerous, the spout becomes taller than in previous phases. In all, prior to the latest discoveries, more than 350 moche burials have been scientifically excavated. Of these, many were found at major settlements that also contain impressive moche-style pyramids. In the simpler burials, the body was merely wrapped in a plain cotton shroud and placed face upwards in a shallow pit. In the more elaborate finds, the body was either wrapped in many shrouds and twined cane matting, or placed in a box-like cane coffin. Whilst no manifestly royal tomb has thus far been found, since those from the major sites have been so completely looted long ago, the available burials were suggestive of a highly stratified society. As we have seen, Moche civilization is now known to have spread far beyond the original Rio Moche Valley sites. In other valleys from the Rio Piura to the north to the Rio Nepena Valley at some distance to the south of Moche contain at least one or two major monuments which, if smaller in size, presented similar features to those of the Rio Moche Valley itself, which continued to flourish until about AD 600, both as an urban complex and as an important center of government. Records in clay. Since the Mochica, like all Andean peoples, had no writing, any attempt to reconstruct their history and their way of life is fraught with obvious problems. However, no other people of the world, with the possible exception of the ancient Greeks, recorded so many details of their culture on their pottery as the Mochica. Clearly, as we shall see, this legacy in clay is rich in symbols that are constantly repeated and which are intended to convey a specific meaning. Notwithstanding the depredations of the Huaqueros, a copious store of Mochica pottery survives, mainly unearthed some time before the great Waka Rajada discoveries. They have been described and illustrated in Elizabeth Benson's book on the Mochica, which does ample justice to their quality and significance. The pots were obviously made by superb craftsmen, who are themselves never illustrated on these vessels. Countless pots offer representations of chieftains and thus offer a forestate of Mochica culture, some aspects of which were later to be confirmed by the rich store of unlooted royal burials more recently found at Waka Rajada. Others show warriors in battle, ritual processions, fishing, the hunting of deer, together with pictures of boats, houses, as well as geographical features such as marshes and deserts. But notwithstanding their striking realism, they clearly also had a sacred function. They are both realist and surrealist. A pot in the shape of a squash may have a neck that turns into a bird's head. Beans at times have legs and faces and carry weapons. Several pots from the Pyramid of the Moon, together with the wall painting, show animated objects such as weapons and warriors' garments. But the large helmets often have small human legs, clubs have faces, and kilted skirts sprout tiny human features. While religion plays a major part in this ceramic iconography, it is not easy to interpret. The supreme deity of the Moche apparently dwelt in the mountains. As described by Benson, he is often shown sitting on a platform or a throne surrounded by lofty peaks. Neither human nor involved in human affairs, he thus appears as kind of an impassionate deus otiosas who, as in certain other cultures, having created the world, withdraws into a remoteness from the affairs of men. More frequently depicted than this creator is a god with a Chavin-type feline mouth, snake's head earrings, and a jaguar headdress. Snakes also extend from his belt. This second deity is depicted as a vigorous figure, with arms and legs in constant motion. He may perhaps be seen as an active representative of the supreme mountain deity, a kind of god the sun. He is always fanged. Though at times he seems to be a sea god, he is essentially the deity of the coastal people, protecting them from sea monsters. Typical of these are a fish and a crab monster. The former is half human, with human arms and legs. He usually holds a knife. The deity is at times accompanied by a small, spotted animal who follows him like a pet, and occasionally nips the crab monster. Music apparently played a major part in Mochica ritual, particularly in funeral rites. The Fang deity himself is depicted playing panpipes. Examples of these have been found, sometimes lying beside the dead as if ready to be played. Sacrificial themes also abound. Some take place in the mountains as offerings of human life to the creator god, usually involving two victims. The other major sacrificial theme involves not the creator but the fanged god and seems to take place in the sea. Again, two victims are involved. One body rides the crest of a breaking wave, which the fanged god watches from beyond the wave. While the supreme god appears to be indifferent to the fate of his victims, the fanged god observes them closely. Other vessels also illustrate human sacrifice, sometimes in the form of naked warriors with ropes around their necks. Trophy heads depicted on pottery confirm sacrificial decapitation. In one death scene, the victim is tied to a stake and abandoned to vultures. In other scenes, birds peck at the eyes and genitalia of bound victims. Numerous animals appear in Moche art, in many cases associated with religious practices. To give only a few examples of the many animals represented, bats, often half human, appear with trophy heads and are associated with human sacrifice and ritual. Hawks appear frequently, usually also anthropomorphic. These serve as warriors and messengers, as do hummingbirds. Deer act as messengers and occasionally as warriors. Deer with human arms sometimes are shown. In one scene, the deer is sitting, holding two young deer as a human mother would. One group of effigy pots consists of birds and foxes, together with deer or seals seated and playing a drum. Warfare is naturally a major theme in this rich documentation provided by Moche's ceramics. One curious feature of such scenes is that while the chief deity is shown in combat with monsters, he never appears as a leader in human battles, and pots in which this god carries conventional arms are very rare. The warlike nature of the Moche is amply illustrated in their pottery, and great numbers exist both of painted battle scenes and of effigy warriors. The latter wear knives attached to their belts, but these are never used in battle scenes. The main weapon is a large club, and on the defensive arm is a square or round shield. At times, the Moche fight each other in hand-to-hand combat, and in other cases, to judge by the peculiar garb of the defeated warriors, these are depicted as foreigners. Such ceramic scenes suggest that they did not fight to kill, but to take prisoners, since no one is ever shown dead in battle. Some scenes illustrate naked prisoners seated, apparently awaiting ceremonial decapitation. While in actual battle scenes, the combatants who take prisoners are always human. In another category of painted pots, figures in warriors' dress are shown. Appearing usually in pairs, they have the faces of hummingbirds, hawks, owls, foxes, deer, or even snakes. Another curious character is that of a warrior with the body of a lima bean. Some painted pots show human figures running through a landscape, apparently carrying bags containing beans. Like the pots representing warriors, those representing runners sometimes show humans, and in other anthropomorphic animals of all kinds act as runners. In two cases, animal-headed runners are shown as approaching a pyramid or temple. In one of these, the deity sits on top of the temple, as if the runner seems to be his messenger or servant. Various aspects of the Moche economy are also shown on pots. Many depict rafts. Often a deity is shown on the boat, but even if such scenes are partly mythological, such rafts were surely used by men who actually went to sea. Shellfish are abundantly represented on the pottery. Numerous food plants cultivated by the Mochica are also illustrated, including maize, lima beans, peanuts, sweet potatoes, peppers, as well as various forms of squash. The importance of maize is indicated by representations, many of which show the head of the Fang deity emerging from the ears of maize. Lima beans also play a special role. They are the only vegetable that is truly anthropomorphic. With heads, arms, and legs, lima beans are shown as warriors and messengers in both painted and modeled versions. Finally, birth and death were also subjects that are often depicted on Moche ceramics. Before the Great Cyprian discoveries, one of the most important burials is that known at the tomb of the warrior priest at the Waka Dela Cruz in the Rio Viru Valley. There are, however, many dead people illustrated on Moche pottery. Both in pots and modeled figures, the dead are usually shown with skulls and bony ribs. They are nude, and the penis is often erect. Another most curious feature is the appearance of the dead in scenes of sexual activity. Such depictions form part of a large corpus of erotic Mochica art. Kissing is almost non-existent, and an odd phenomenon is the frequent illustration of anal coitus. Fellatio, the contact between the female mouth and the male sex organ, was also a common theme. Explanation both as to the abundance of Mochica erotic pottery and its peculiar features is hard to find. Raphael Larco Hoyle found many erotic pots in graves of children, while in other graves skeletal figures perform sexual acts but never coitus, and it becomes difficult to conclude that such pottery was mere pornography. On the other hand, if these scenes were viewed in a ceremonial or religious context, they would logically be connected with the notion of fertility, as the prominent sexual organs might suggest. But if that were the case, why do so many pots show anal coitus? Waka Rahada. Having first reviewed the data on Moche culture already obtained before the late 1980s, it now becomes appropriate to relate in more detail the story of the discoveries at Waka Rahada, some 170 kilometers to the north of the Rio Moche pyramids. In the words of Sidney Kirkpatrick, they represent a quantum leap in our knowledge, as compared with anything previously achieved. As already stated, it was the looter Ernil Bernal who discovered the first royal burial chambers. After working at a feverish pace, he and his teammates emerged haggard and exhausted, carrying 11 rice sacks filled with treasure, enough, in the words of one of the looters, to turn the poorest of them into the richest hacienda owner of the coastal plains. Other treasure hunters were not slow to enter the field, and heated arguments then led to a shootout. However, it was not until 2 weeks later that the chief of the local police, Walter Mondragon, contacted Dr. Walter Alva, Inspector General of Archaeology in Lambayeque, and director of the local Bruning Museum. Alva had, of course, known of the massive scale of looting of local sites, much of which had taken place in the past 5 years, but had been powerless to prevent this continuous process of plunder. At first, however, Alva thought that the report of the chief of police was little more than a hoax, since Waka Rahada was not commonly associated with Moche, but with the Chimu, a much later pre-Inca culture. But together with the golden head of a puma, clearly a Moche work of art, Mondragon handed Alva fistfuls of shiny gold beads and, among other treasures, a ceremonial gold rattle in the shape of a half-moon. To cite Kirkpatrick, incised upon it was indisputable confirmation of the origin of the artifacts. The carved figure of a fearsome Moche deity holding a ceremonial knife in one hand, and the decapitated head of a prisoner in the other. Alva was left speechless. The Huaqueros had discovered something of which most archaeologists doubted the existence: the intact tomb of a Moche lord. From that point onwards, singular events followed in quick succession. First, before a caravan of 8 policemen reached the Bernal house, Alva had already made the horrendous discovery in a nearby irrigation ditch of the smashed remains of some 250 ceramic vases, together with a large quantity of copper ornaments and some jewelry. Only the most saleable treasures had been retained, and already dispatched to antiquities dealers in Lima and Trujillo. The fate of these treasures led to some bizarre consequences. Typical of these, it may be worth citing a single incident. Among the first of the international dealers in stolen art to arrive on the scene was Don Poli. He first collected from his bank in Lima $40,000. The bank could only produce small denomination bills, and he arrived in Trujillo with 3 suitcases containing his bundle of cash. Here he came into contact with a local dealer, who used the pseudonym Pereda. After protracted negotiations, Pereda produced a single piece, of the many of which he apparently disposed, a palm-sized statue of a Moche lord, its eyes encrusted with lapis lazuli. In one hand, the lord had a finely carved shield, and in the other hand, a gold pyramid-shaped rattle. Police settled for a price of $75,000, $35,000 in excess of the contents of his suitcases of small bills. After a protracted search of the countryside, Poli finally returned with an entire carful of even smaller bills in cardboard boxes and shopping bags in order to complete the payment of the $75,000. Poli was eventually able to accumulate a major share of the original loot from Waka Rajada. Unlike others involved, he escaped major litigation and imprisonment either in Peru or in the USA, to which many other pieces had been shipped. He also managed to have 170 pieces of looted Waka Rajada treasure registered with the Peruvian National Institute of Culture as their legal owner. Some of Poli's comments to the police were included in an information agency's report to the President of the United States, a report which, eventually in June of 1991, led a stricter enforcement of antiquities regulations, and in particular a ban on the importation of all artifacts from Waka Rajada. Apart from Poli's haul, much royal treasure extracted by the looters did reach the USA by somewhat circuitous routes. Prominent among those involved was David Swetnam, a professional dealer in pre-Columbian objects. One of his methods for smuggling these works of art into the USA was to cover them with a cream-colored clay slip, after which they could be taken for contemporary pots made by Amazonian Shipibo Indians. Many of Swetnam's customers were among the richest Californians, including Hollywood film producers and Los Angeles real estate developers, whom he courted with poolside cocktails and even sumptuous banquets. His career as a dealer ended when, following denunciation by certain informants, in March 1988, 60 armed customs agents launched the biggest raid and achieved the largest seizure of pre-Columbian art in U.S. history. Most of this came not from Waka Rajada, but from yet another royal Moche burial chamber discovered at La Mina, located south at Lambayeque. In all, 1,369 artifacts were seized. The ensuing litigation produced few results, since the judicial process was brought to a virtual standstill by a crack legal defense team. Though Swetnam himself did receive a prison sentence of 6 months. In the end of a mere 123 works of Peruvian art forfeited by the United States collectors were returned to Peru. A ceremony was held on December 2nd, 1989 at Lima Airport to celebrate this event, to which Enrique Poli, the proud and legal possessor of the largest privately held collection of Waka Rajada gold, was not invited. The Royal Tombs. The astonishing series of events outlined above relates more to the ultimate fate of the looted treasures and of the looters themselves and their wealthy clients. Far more significant in the context of Mochi's studies was the division of Alva on April 13th, 1987, that he himself would undertake the excavation of the remainder of Waka Rahada, after police had already cleared the site both of plunderers and of demonstrators who protested against hitherto ineffective police action. Even more decisive was the arrival 4 days later of the most distinguished Mochi scholar Christopher Donen. Alva was familiar with Donen's 2 books on the Mochi, hence his reputation preceded him when he arrived at the Bruni Museum and introduced himself to Alva. The story of what followed is described by Donen in the fine catalog of the exhibition held in the Fowler Museum of Los Angeles, the New York Natural History Museum, and other prestigious institutions which displayed the magnificent Waka Rahada discoveries. Donen's account stresses that the ruins near Saipan had been virtually unknown before the recent work began. The 2 large truncated pyramids were connected by a complex series of ramps. The third and smaller pyramid, where the tomb had been looted, appears to have been freestanding, connected to the larger pyramids only by a plaza. This huge complex had been constructed over a period of many years and had undergone many changes. It was clearly a Mochi creation, though certain evidence suggests that further changes occurred after the end of the Mochi era. The small pyramid, as we have seen, had been the object of a much more aggressive attack on the part of the looters. Paradoxically, the looters' backdirt had helped to preserve these structures' original form, and subtle features of its architecture showed that it had also been the product of successive periods of construction. In its earliest phase, it appears to have been merely a low rectangular platform. Donen suggests that this phase may belong to the 1st century AD, and was followed by 5 further stages, of which the last was completed in AD 300. Most surprisingly, the looters had missed some of the original objects in the tomb which they penetrated. Of these, by far the most remarkable was a heavy copper scepter, 1 meter long, with a point at one end and a complex architectural model at the other, consisting of a small structure with a gabled roof. On the ridgeline of the roof were 17 double-faced human heads. The back portion, formed by a wall, depicted a haunting scene, a supernatural creature, half feline and half reptile, copulating with a woman riding on a crescent moon. The scepter surely formed part of the ceremony paraphernalia of a very high-status Mochi lord. Alva and Donen recognized this creature as the supreme Mochi spirit in its most fearsome incarnation, half feline and half reptile. Mouth open and claws extended, the fanged deity plunged its penis deep into the female victim's spread legs. Tomb 1. Alva and Donen decided not to initiate a large dig at the summit of the main complex, which would be too vulnerable to looters once the excavation ended. A preliminary study of a 10 by 10 meter area a little below the summit yielded a remarkable collection of fine ceramics. A total of 1,137 vessels were removed from a chamber that held probably the largest offering of pre-Columbian ceramics ever discovered. As this chamber was studied, another area slightly to the southeast was examined. First, a single skeleton of a man was discovered about 4 meters below the original surface of the pyramid. But some 50 centimeters beneath this burial were the remains of large wooden beams. One fact was evident: the pattern of these roof beams was intact, and whatever chamber lay below had remained forever undisturbed. In penetrating the chamber, they first found an adult male between 35 and 50 years at the time of his death. The left foot was missing. His body was covered with copper objects, and alongside lay a large war club, encased in copper sheet. On the other side of the royal burial itself was another cane coffin placed on top of a sacrificial llama. It contained a male victim between 35 and 45 years old. The wood of the coffin of the royal burial itself had long since decomposed. However, its contents were still intact, and as described by Walter Alva and Christopher Donen, constituted the richest burial ever excavated anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and would therefore prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of our generation. To name only a few of the objects found, on top of the royal headdress was a large gold ingot, The metal was so pure that its surface remained uncorroded. Much of the area inside the coffin was covered over with beaded pectorals. Such pectorals had never been excavated archaeologically. The task proved a formidable challenge, and their removal took several weeks. As they thus came closer to the body itself, the quantity and quality of the personal ornaments dramatically increased. To cite only a single example of the copious treasures, the most amazing of the ear ornaments was a pair depicting warriors. Meticulously detailed, the two warriors stood about the size of a man's thumb, each holding a war club in his clenched fist. The figures wore no fewer than 4 necklaces, including one consisting of 16 gold links depicting human heads. The deceased clenched in his right hand a large gold and silver scepter. The scepter held in his left hand had an elaborate finial at its upper end. 3 other cane coffins contained adult females, 2 of which were stacked one on top of the other at the head of the main tomb, while the third lay at its foot. On examination, a strange fact emerged. These female skeletal remains suggest that they had died long before the principal figure and that their bodies were partially decomposed when they were placed in his tomb. The bones were jumbled in ways that could not have incurred enough and into decomposition of their bodies. There is no evidence as to how long the women had been dead. It is even possible that they may have been dead before the principal male was even born. When all these additional coffins had already been put in place, the whole tomb had then been sealed by the beam roof. Since it was only slightly higher than the benches that extended along the sides of the chamber, the roof was too low to have created a room in which people entering later could have stood upright. Tomb 2. While work on this tomb was still in progress, other parts of the pyramid were also examined. At one point, 2.4 meters below ground surface, a llama skull was found. A few centimeters lower was an adult male lying on his back, buried in a cane coffin. Like the burial situated above Tomb 1, the man's feet were missing. After removal of the roof beams, a plank coffin was found, smaller than that of Tomb 1, but nonetheless indicative that this was also a royal burial. In addition to many fine ornaments, the occupant of this tomb wore 2 extraordinary necklaces of human head beads. The faces were smiling on one necklace and frowning on the other. The motif of complementary smiling and frowning faces was heretofore unknown in ancient Peruvian art and remains an unexplained mystery. The individual in question was an adult male, some 40 years old and 1.5 meters tall. Unlike the first tomb, this principal figure himself wore no lavish jewelry and ornaments. However, beneath where his head rested was found a spectacular headdress ornament of gilded copper. At its center were the head and body of an owl, whose eyes were inlaid with white shell and turquoise. On each side of the principal figure lay the remains of a young female with no coffin, while crosswise to his feet was the body of a 10-year-old child placed in a coffin that also contained the skeletons of a dog and a snake. The main difference between the two tombs was one of scale. Not only was Tomb 2 smaller, but there were considerably fewer grave contents, and with certain exceptions of lower quality. As these offerings on the south platform were excavated, yet a third royal tomb was found, lying more than 5 meters below the surface of the pyramid. It soon became evident that since it was below the later burials, the tomb was earlier than those described above. The principal body was placed not in a room-sized chamber, but in a simple pit. It had no plank coffin, but was wrapped in several textile shrouds. Nonetheless, this earlier tomb yielded many fine works of art, including a magnificent gold necklace of 10 large beads, and depicting a spider with a body in the form of a human head. Another masterpiece was a feline head made of gilded copper. The ferocious expression of its face was enhanced by a double-headed serpent headdress. Both around and above the body lay multiple sets of the finest necklaces, ear ornaments, and nose ornaments of gold and silver, piled one on top of another in a dazzling display of wealth and opulence, too numerous to describe in detail. Finally, the excavators reached the actual body. The skull was fairly well preserved, and the skeletal remains were of an adult aged about 50, 1.6 meters tall. A large gold ingot had been placed in his mouth, and 2 large silver ingots were placed on top of his chin. The Mochi Rail. Certainly, one of the major lessons to be learned from these Saipan tombs is that the Mochi culture was even more refined and complex than we had previously realized, notwithstanding the copious data already supplied by activities depicted on Moche ceramics, above all, available in the pictographic archive located on the campus of the University of California at Los Angeles. But no burials previously excavated bore even a remote comparison with those of Saipan, nor had they yielded objects of a comparable refinement. From illustrations such as earlier finds, the essence of Moche warfare was shown to be not mass battles, but rather the exercise of individual valor in which warriors engaged in single combat. Great stress is placed on the capture of prisoners, who were taken to a place where they could be arraigned before a high individual in the vicinity of a large pyramid. Following arraignment, the prisoners were ceremoniously sacrificed by the cutting of their throats, and their blood was ritually consumed by those present. In a typical scene, the leading figure is designated as the warrior priest, accompanied by the bird priest and the bird priestess. A most significant feature of Tomb 1 is that nearly all the objects found in that tomb were related to a sacrifice ceremony, as already depicted on ceramics unearthed in previous decades. To cite a single example, the duck is often illustrated in the latter as an anthropomorphized warrior who participates in the sacrifice ceremony. The duck also appears on gold and turquoise ear ornaments in Tomb 1, which may be related to his involvement in the ceremony where prisoners were ritually slain. The warrior priest mentioned above was consistently represented with large conical helmet with crescent-shaped ornaments, large circular ear ornaments, bracelets, and a warrior back flap. He frequently wears a crescent-shaped nose ornament. Each of these tombs was also found inside the plank coffin of the central figure of tomb number 1. The relative longevity of the Moche civilization has already been stressed, and recent research has added a new perspective to our knowledge of its refinement, complexity, and even its extent. Saipan is situated some 150 kilometers to the north of the Great Pyramids of the Rio Moche Valley. Moreover, from what we have now learned from their intact burial chambers of Saipan, it now becomes almost certain that the massive quantities of fine metal objects looted by robbers in the 1960s from the site of Loma Negra, situated yet a further 200 kilometers to the north of Saipan, also were taken from the tombs of high-status Moche princes. Moreover, at a congress held in Trujillo in 1993, while not rejecting Larco Hoyle's original 5 phases of Moche culture, it was stressed that elements recalling Moche the First and Moche the Second were also found in these northerly settlements. Hence, Moche sites, both early and late, are known to have occupied a very long stretch of the Pacific coast. Less is known of Moche political organization, and it becomes most questionable whether anything in the nature of an overall Moche kingdom existed rather than a series of settlements that shared a common culture. The central figure of the complex tombs of Saipan is more generally described as a warrior priest. Nonetheless, in view of the distances involved between many Moche sites, it might be logical to assume that such individuals, buried with so much elaborate ceremony, were in practice more likely to have been independent potentates rather than subjects or representatives of some kind of Moche emperor situated in the Rio Moche Valley or elsewhere. Their situation was perhaps more comparable to that of the independent principalities of Renaissance Italy than to the unified kingdoms of England or France. This concludes Chapter 2.